maybe we would do it without the background music. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of OXSCIE. I hope everyone, the mic is not, is that better? Good morning again, everyone. And welcome to day 2 of OXSCIE. I hope we all had a good rest and we're ready for another day of really significant progress towards our productive discussions on the role of education in responding to uncertainty. I'm here this morning to introduce our keynote speaker, and I am absolutely delighted to be able to introduce you all to Alice Nderitu. But before I do that, I thought it might be helpful if I were to explain a little bit about why we have brought Alice all the way from Kenya to speak to you today. And by way of that introduction, I want to tell you a little bit about my organization, which is the Global Centre for Pluralism, based in Ottawa, Canada, a center that it's an independent international education and research center established under a partnership between the Government of Canada and His Highness the Aga Khan. The center serves as a global platform for analysis, education, and dialogue about the choices and actions that enable societies to live peacefully and productively with diversity. Pluralism, and you've been hearing that term quite a bit over the course of the past day, and I hope you hear a little bit more in the coming day and weeks and months and years. Pluralism is defined by the center as an ethic of respect for diversity. It's a positive response to the presence of diversity. Pluralism results from the daily decisions taken by state institutions, civil society organizations, and individuals to recognize and value human differences. And as a small knowledge organization based far, far away in Canada, we thought that rather than simply telling people about what it looks like to advance pluralism in the world, we do a lot of that, but we also thought it might be effective to show people what it looks like to advance pluralism in the world. And so we created the Global Pluralism Award. And the Global Pluralism Award is meant to identify, recognize, celebrate, and support examples of effective approaches in promoting pluralism in widely different contexts in different societies around the world. And so before I tell you more about Alice and her work, I'd actually like to show you a little bit about Alice's work. Sahar, I need some help with this.
Okay, no problem.
Here we go.
The challenge we face is not a challenge of the past. It's a challenge of the future. How do you build a future where we can live inclusively?
Alice is, I think, a really consummate facilitator. Alice has a capacity to get people who are in extreme situations of conflict and mistrust to trust her.
We don't have so many women mediators. She has a drive to continue doing it irrespective of the challenges, largely because I think she believes in people, even when people don't believe in themselves.
The peace agreements that Alice facilitated in Nakuru, in Plateau, and Kaduna states in Nigeria are in themselves affirmations that a pluralist agenda is what these communities want going forward, and they're committing themselves to pluralism through the agreements that Alice has drafted.
To see the smile in the face of a community member who cannot go back to his or her house and not be afraid that the neighbors will come again in the night to attack. Nothing could be more powerful than that. Nothing could be more fulfilling.
We can never allow what divides us to build into biases and stereotypes that then translate into violence. You can keep fighting and fighting, but we are going to be here until one day you'll tell us, but why are you still here? We don't need you. We have peace now. And I told them, and that day will come, and I believe in it, and you must believe in it as well.
It's very likely that few, if any of you, had ever heard of the name Alice Nderitu before you saw Alice's name on the program for OXSCIE. Alice is one of those unsung heroes on the front lines of peace mediation. Beyond the elder statesmen who are often parachuted into mediation processes, it's the Alices of the world that actually get us to peace. Alice's story is remarkable for so many reasons. Among these is the fact that throughout her career, she's held positions and responsibilities and engaged in roles that traditionally are held only by men in her society. She served as commissioner of the National Cohesion and Integration Commission in Kenya after violence rocked the country following elections in 2008. She's a member of the Women Waging Peace Network and the Community of Experts of Resolution to Act for Women Mediators in Washington, D.C., and has been a long-time advisor for the Geneva-based Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. Alice is a prolific writer and has published works including Beyond Ethnicism, Exploring Racial Diversity for Educators, and that's a teacher's manual that was approved by the Kenyan Institute for Curriculum Development. Kenya, Bridging Ethnic Divides, A Commissioner's Experience on Cohesion and Integration. Alice has published many chapters, policy papers, and opinion pieces, including Minding the Gap, African Conflict Management in a Time of Change, which was edited by Pamela All and Chet Crocker in Washington, D.C. Alice was nominated for and won our inaugural Global Pluralism Award for the approach that she has taken in conflict mediation, an approach that demonstrates pluralism in action. Alice worked to promote pluralism at all levels of mediation and conflict prevention, not only for the sake of those who have historically been excluded from their communities, but also because she knows that having diverse voices meet in respectful dialogue is the only way to achieve long-lasting peace. However, we did not bring Alice to Oxford to talk about the importance of integrating pluralism into peace processes. We invited Alice to speak about the role and the potential of education in fostering societies where human differences are respected. And so I would like to invite Alice to share some of her thoughts and reflections with us all today. Alice.
I would like to start off by saying good morning, everyone. And to thank you, Jayne, most sincerely for not only that kind introduction, but also for inviting me to speak here, because if it wasn't for you and Katie, Oxford wouldn't even know about me. I have a story for everything, and I actually have a story about how this particular institution, Oxford, played a part in getting me into doing what I'm doing. But I'll talk about it only if I have extra time, so that I can get immediately into my speech. And again, I would also like to say thank you to many of you who are here who played a huge role and whom I almost gave a heart attack last week when I said I couldn't get a visa. And And that was on Friday, I think, and you had a very long weekend, and so did I, and you got me a visa on Monday morning and put me a plane on Monday, and here I am. So thank you very much. So I'd also been asked to speak to my views on the politics of difference in Kenyan society and the role that education might play to promote productive diversity and cohesion, alongside my topic, which is responding to uncertainty, pluralism in and through education. So in 2007 and 2008, because I've spoken to a lot of people in this room who have Kenyan connections or who are Kenyan or who've lived in Kenya, you would know that Kenya had a post-election crisis that resulted in intense ethnic violence. And on 30th April 2009, a motion was tabled in Parliament seeking adoption for the nominees of a commission that I was to work in, the National Cohesion and Integration Commission, which is mandated to deal with and mediate ethnic and race-related conflicts and promote peaceful and harmonious coexistence in Kenya. Now, the mover of the motion, Honorable Abdikadir Mohammed, moved the House with a description of the state of affairs in my country, showing how animosity among ethnic communities was tearing the nation apart. His sentiments were not new. In 1965, 2 years after independence, at a conference titled Racial and Communal Tensions, Lawrence Sagini, who was Kenya's first Minister for Education, expressed concern about what he termed several problems, such as tribalism, with some groups feeling that they're not getting their fair share of the cake. That was 2 years after independence. So these concerns remain relevant to date, and preventing another cycle of ethnic violence in all the parts of Africa I work in remains core to what I do. Though I'm Kenyan, I've spent the last 7 years working in Nigeria, and many feel that strong frontline institutions are the answer, and I'm one of those who feel that. And I have worked to set up 2 more commissions, like the one I worked in, the Cohesion and Integration Commission. So I've worked to set up one in Plateau State in Nigeria, the Plateau State Peace Building Agency, and in Kaduna State, now 1 year old, we have the Kaduna Peace Commission. So then 10 years since Kenya set up a strong frontline institution, the NCIC, that's the Cohesion and Integration Commission, we have had gains and reversals in the search for national cohesion. Kenya still faces major challenges, including low sentiment levels of national identity and citizenship. Citizenship in particular, as a primary identity, continues to be eclipsed by competitive electoral politics, mobilized around ethnic groups, intercommunal mistrust and tensions, and the rise of ethnic and racial identities. So when I worked at the Cohesion and Integration Commission, we told educators to assist learners from different cultural backgrounds to develop self-esteem and a strong sense of personal identity as members of their ethno-cultural groups through awareness of their own cultural, linguistic, and historical heritage, while at the same time promote a national identity over ethnic identity. So what we didn't know then was that we were trying to define pluralism. So the Global Center for Pluralism has simplified all that by defining pluralism as an ethic of respect for human differences. So there's this great writer, his name is Claude Ake. Claude Ake, in his seminal paper, What is the Problem of Ethnicity in Africa?, speaks of our ability as Africans to restrict the pluralist basis of democracy to political pluralism and to denigrate social pluralism. And the Kenyan state, and of course, and many others in this age of uncertainty, seems to stand on the verge of a transition to national cohesion that is yet to be fully defined in terms of direction and outcomes. I'm often struck by how the predominant themes of inequalities, inequities, and ethnic violence work hand in hand, and conversely, by the absence of education material on how to address pluralism and these themes jointly on my continent. So I've met many people who hurt from xenophobia or ethnic violence, and they ask, why can't we form a basis for inventing we-ness based on Ubuntu or Utu, and Ubuntu or Utu meaning what we call shared humanity. Ubuntu or Utu, Kiswahili is Utu, and Ubuntu would be Zulu. it speaks to, it's a phrase that means that you are only a human because you recognize my humanity. So, like, if you are just alone and I'm not there, then you wouldn't be a human being, you would be something else. So people ask me, so why don't we dissolve our ethnic and racial communities through Ubuntu and Utu into Kenyanness or Africanness? And in practice, because now we are living in a global world, this has proved to be almost contextually impossible. And my lived experience is that I have had most success mediating ethnic conflict in places where people come to the peace table with the realization that their identities will not be diluted or diminished, where they represent either one or all of their identities. It is therefore a proven fact through the kind of work that we do that engaging with pluralism as a concept that builds on identities as strengths ensures sustainable results in resolution of ethnic conflicts. So why is pluralism so important for Kenya, and I could say the world today? Because our lived realities are driving us into cocoons. In many parts of Africa, this is coming from a place of scarcity and threat mentality. People have to deal with the absence of pluralistic solutions from a personal level, having to flee, for instance, during elections, or fight on the basis of identity. So there is almost a natural tendency for people in times of scarcity to be inward-looking, to find changes at the most basic level. We become more conscious of how different we are. In Kenya, it's about leadership and the perception, real or imagined, that resources follow leadership. And ethnic communities fight violently for control of scarce spaces in leadership. But often people ask me, so how come ethnic communities will fight against each other, say, during elections? But then we keep intermarrying across ethnic communities. And I always tell them because we happily intermarry because there's no scarcity in that respect, and or threat. So long as people don't feel there's any threat, then they're comfortable doing it. So then the question that, of course, I keep asking, and that I was asking when I was preparing for this, is it therefore more sustainable to put legitimate structures in place that facilitate processes rooted in pluralism, equity, equality, social cohesion, and participation? What would be the contours towards the realization of the effectiveness of such a society and the strategy used to realize this vision? How do we stop violent ethnic divisions and end the internal contradictions of an age when people are more aware and more conscious through social media and so many aspects, but yet increasingly deeply divided? So these are important questions because identity is powerful, and in many places I work with, it's also poisonous in the sense that identity is all one is left with when everything else is taken away. It always fascinates me to, in the places that I work in, when people are running away from conflict, I look at what they carry. What is it that they carry? Because what is so important to them that when you are told you have 5 minutes to leave your home, what do you carry? And I always think to myself that I'll probably carry my laptop because everything is in there, and because that's the age I live in, and because I have copies of my certificates and everything. And it really, really, really hits me when I look at people carrying mattresses. They carry mattresses mostly. And the mattresses are so old, and you can just see the cracks in the mattresses. People carry cooking pots, and they're broken, and they carry water containers to carry water. And I always think to myself, like in terms of priorities, it just shows, like in terms of survival, people just want the basics, the food and the shelter and the water, and because that's all that's there on their head. And when I'm running towards the conflict and they're running away from the conflict, and I'm just mentally photographing all these things they're carrying and framing the solution in terms of what they're carrying on their heads. So then, the essence of pluralism then for me is that we should not take identity away from people. Because when you take away the mattress and you take away the cooking pot, then the person is left standing alone, and all they have left is identity. And it is important to let them to be pluralistic because identity is a very powerful place to mobilize from. If we are not pluralistic, people will set up their own rules of mobilization And the consequences, in my context, unfortunately, increasingly point at ethnic violence. So then, the big question is, could the education sector then shape and sustain a society that is at once plural and cosmopolitan, prosperous and inclusive, fair and responsible, as well as cohesive, and provide an opportunity for various educators like yourselves to harmonize their strategies and benefit from collective visioning? Do we know the change we seek and how to recognize and sustain it when it happens? When we are looking for a world that is not uncertain, do we know what we are looking for? If we do, then why do we have many negative unintended consequences of good intentions? And now I'm talking about my work in terms of seeking plural solutions, because sometimes they are negatives. Like, for example, in our quest for cultural pluralism, for instance, how do we deal with undesired consequences such as separatism? People who say, okay, now our identity is strong enough for us to stand alone. We don't want to be part of this country. And in Kenya, we have the Mombasa Republican Council. In Nigeria, there is Biafra. So what do different education stakeholders need to prioritize in terms of philosophy, theory, design, content, implementation, and sequencing, in terms of strategies to realize our pluralistic vision? Because truly, I really still believe that pluralism is the answer. So then we then ask ourselves, if pluralism is the answer, is part of the answer then a pluralistic approach that also encourages purposeful government strategies to diminish equality? I say this taking note of the words of Katerina Tomaszewski, whom I knew, the first UN Special Rapporteur on the right to education, when she said that education can be a means to retain as well as to eliminate inequality, as it can serve two contradictory purposes, two opposite results may ensue. And she was talking at that time about the role of education in apartheid. So I have in my lifetime developed a strong sense of the need to use education spaces to counter influences that lead to fear and exclusion of others. And I started off my life working as a teacher, and then I worked in human rights, and then I worked as a journalist. I've done a lot of things with my life. And I was privileged to found the Human Rights Education Department of the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, really powerful department up to now. And I also, when I worked as a commissioner with the Cohesion and Integration Commission, I was again in charge of education. And between those two commissions, I worked for an NGO called Fahamu, which was incidentally headquartered here in Oxford, but I was based in Africa, and I worked around the continent, especially training people, building capacities on conflict prevention and human rights. So then it was this experience, together with a conversation with a teacher, who asked me what educators could do to interrupt the formation of ethnicist thinking in a child, that prompted me to author Beyond Ethnicism, Exploring Ethnic and Racial Diversity for Educators, that Jayne has just mentioned. I used to take teachers to Rwanda, for example, to see like genocide in like what the results of genocide are. I used to work around fundraising for school debates and drama festivals, that kind of thing. And then one teacher told me, thank you so much for all the work that you do with us, but until you tell me, when I spot a 10-year-old boy who is already exhibiting signs of one day becoming an ethnic warlord, until you tell me how to stop his thinking at that point, then all these things you are doing will fade away in time. So then I wrote that book. I wrote the manual to respond to that. So then, I used the term ethnicism from its definition as an ideology, focusing on the superiority of one generally narrow ethnic or national group. And I used the term ethnicism to replace tribalism. The manual's organizing principle is that the diversity of my country, Kenya's ethnicities, races, languages, cultures, and religion should not be a pretext for conflict, but rather a source of identity as a nation. So the manual helps educators to overcome resistance by fellow educators and learners to their ideas, and to achieve and measure results in school communities, and to lead change initiatives that address mainly ethnic tensions. Of course, it's called Exploring Ethnic and Racial Diversity, but my focus, because I spend a lot of time working with ethnic communities that are in conflict, my focus was not racial, although in Kenya we have different races, but I was focusing on the people, like my focus is usually on the people who actually run around with machetes and cut off each other's heads. And my editor, her name is Zarina Patel, and she's Kenyan Asian. And she told me, your manual is really beautiful, but I don't see myself in it. And it made me look at things from a different perspective. It actually made me learn a lot. So there's a bit of race in it, but not as much as Zarina would have wanted, because I really stuck to, let's stick with the guys who are capable of cutting off people's heads. So, or who do it. And I'm not undermining, of course, the race differences, but what I try to do is get people to get from a point of not being violent to a point of where they'll sit at a table and speak with each other. And that's where I usually come from. So then I've learned several lessons that can constitute the educational response to uncertainty and the changing nature of society, particularly as informs countries grappling with ethnic divisions. And the first lesson is that peace is political. So therefore, pluralism is political too, and it's always good to remember that when you are advocating for peace, when people have been fighting. To prevent, transform, or solve ethnic conflict in any society, the education sector is crucial in building a school community of parents, learners, and educators to build relationships across racial and ethnic groups. I've negotiated many ethnic conflicts across my continent. I've drafted a lot of peace agreements. Quite a number have held. And I can tell you that in all the conflicts I've mediated, all of them either resulted from the absence of a relationship or a broken relationship. It's so crucial. Once that is in place, that cog in terms of when you map out the relationships between those who are fighting, then you're almost there. So given the complexity of ethnic and racial division, we need leaders at the highest political levels with the greatest levels of influence to provide legitimacy to the education sector to promote pluralistic societies and deal with ethnic differences that lead to violence. These leaders also need to deal with the structural aspects of ethnicism and implement ethnic and racial equity plans. Progress towards a more equitable non-ethnicist society will need changes in policies, practices, and belief systems over a period of time. I often tell politicians that they are fond of throwing everything at the teachers. They think they can solve everything by putting it in curriculums, and they throw the teachers into the deep end to deal with the problems they've created. And then, very importantly, I have learned that educators need to be taught the art of navigating meaningful dialogue on divisions as a first step to devising effective strategies for promoting pluralistic societies. The traditional approach is that of teachers having all the knowledge and learners as receptacles of this knowledge. What we often forget is that teachers usually come from the same society as their learners do, sharing cultural biases, and are usually inadequately prepared to lead a conversation on what divides us. How does a teacher, for example, begin a conversation in a staff room with a fellow teacher or in a class with a learner from an ethnic community that considers them as an enemy purely on the basis of ethnic or racial identity? What could one say as a teacher to enable them listen without judgment? What skills have we empowered teachers with to navigate this kind of scenario? Many teachers are reluctant to challenge existing perceptions, prejudices, and fear of other ethnic communities that may either cause them discomfort or anger, or in which they would be called ethnicists. If there were policies in place and genuine implementation plans to address ethnicism, for example, a teacher skilled in leading this kind of dialogue would be able to articulate that whilst we cannot build trust overnight, we can develop it over time as inequalities are addressed and discuss how to coexist. The teacher would draw out facts to prove that ethnic disparities in access to opportunities or resources are sometimes subject to people's understanding and information, and that emotional debate masks the need to find objective solutions based on facts rather than in sentiments and misconceptions. I've also learned that though many of our conflicts are ethnically or religiously driven and need a pluralistic solution, educators usually prefer to teach generic peace education because religion and ethnic divisions are uncomfortable topics. And I've worked on many peace education curriculums, and I can say this without any fear of contradiction, that peace education assumes a blanket role that does not make anyone uncomfortable, teaches good citizenship, and is easily infused into other subjects. This reduces pressure to directly address, say, ethnic divides, even though they have been known to lead to genocides. It's almost as if we hope that if we do not discuss ethnic and, of course, racial divides, they will go away. The fact that we cannot bring ourselves to discuss actually shows how much it matters to us. So, of course, ethnic issues have to be discussed objectively, openly, and honestly. I've also learned that teaching pluralistic practice needs to be based on infusing daily lessons into incremental habit-forming activities in both curricula and extracurricular activities. And of course, here is the key word is habit-forming. It also needs to be tested alongside, not infused or mainstreamed, other subjects such as mathematics, so as to measure learning outcomes, because often learners study what they'll be tested for. And then I've also learned that we need more initiatives and stories behind the accomplishments on how to sustain a society that is at once plural and cosmopolitan, prosperous and inclusive. For instance, why is there, not so much prosperous, but plural and cosmopolitan and say responsible and cohesive? And we need to, for example, ask ourselves, why, for instance, is there largely no violence between ethnic communities in Ghana? So always we keep focusing on the negatives. We are not looking at, so who is doing it right and what did they do right? Tanzania is also a good example of studying why are they not having ethnic violence. And I'm not talking about Tanzania and in Zanzibar during elections. I'm talking about mainland Tanzania with more than triple the ethnic communities Kenya has. Why do they not fight? So in teaching pluralism, another lesson is that educators need to provide multi-ethnic leadership to move long-term results, as learners need to see themselves among educators. This means that we can afford to have one teacher teaching mathematics or physics or biology or Kiswahili, but we must have teachers from several ethnic communities teaching pluralism. And then another lesson is that we need to start teaching pluralism to young children at an early age before the outside world shapes their opinions as we versus others. And then there's a lot of focus in many countries that are working on hate speech. A lot of people say we need laws on hate speech, we need legislation on hate speech. But what I've learned is that teaching educators to deal with hate speech, stereotypes, biases, and discrimination is important. But a lot of ethnicist behavior is sustained and baked into our belief systems by our parents and societies, policies and practices that shape our daily lives. So it then, therefore, gives people courage to utter hate speech against other communities because of the belief that it's okay. And change does require a conscious interruption, and for this particular sense, an uncomfortable interruption. Through the societies that educators come from, of these beliefs, we need to analyze policies and laws and how we teach, who we include, who we exclude, reshaping institutional practices and beliefs to end their contributions to inequity. When I'm mediating ethnic conflict, beyond the relationships, the other thing that I look at that's very crucial is in terms of exclusion. Who is excluded? So relationships and exclusion is such a priority in terms of finding a solution. Then, of course, textbooks. We still have many parts of the world, many parts of Africa, where history textbooks do not carry the history of every ethnic group. And then for educators working to promote pluralism and community change in places with deeply held beliefs, it is sometimes difficult to define outcomes, as usually those defining are in positions of entrenching the problem. Many of them, as I know, as a woman working in this field, is that many of the custodians of the community's values, such as our respected male elders and grandmothers. This means educators need a shared understanding of pluralism, systemic change, and enough data to defend what they say. For instance, educators should be able to explain the root causes of a particular ethnic conflict and how a pluralistic approach could help solve it with facts. So, like in Nigeria, the communities have helped me to surmount this particular problem. This just an aside. So what they do is that they refer to me as grandma. So, So it helps. So when people talk about you as grandma, then the real grandmothers, when they are talking to you, then they are talking to you as grandma. So then you're able to talk to them respectfully from a space of respect. And then I've also learned that many of those working with communities to solve ethnic conflicts tend to focus heavily on peace-building approaches that favor collaboration, cooperative problem solving, and unifying the warring armed parties who have capacities to cause more violence. So again, we need to make people uncomfortable. And then I've also learned that the educational institutions I have worked with so far on a pluralism agenda seem to prefer long-term institutional level outcomes. It's important to understand that individual learners' personal transformation moments could lead to better and sustained institutional level outcomes. So like learners who are ethnic bigots are usually very confident and have the capability to be great influencers as well. So, and people listen to them. So when such a learner understands pluralism, they can authoritatively interrupt other learners' prejudicial statements. And then, of course, educators with deeper understanding of pluralism need time to integrate this information into their daily lives. This is all long-term. And at the end of it, in conclusion, I would like to say that it took the 2000 post-election violence for the commission that I worked in, the NCIC, the law to be put in place. Implementation has proved to be very, very difficult, but we wrote our way as Kenyans into history as the first African nation that had attempted to deal with our ethnic relations through legislation. But ethnicism is supported by deeply embedded personal attitudes and associations, and it's difficult to make it go away. Yet, as I have said, we intermarry across ethnic communities, and we come together as a nation in times of grief, when our athletes win, and when Barack Obama comes home, and he's coming on July 16th, so watch Kenyans come together. And every 5 years, elections keep tearing this thin fabric apart again and again, eroding all that we achieve in these brief moments of unity. And I would like to end by telling you that 2 years ago, I was having a very difficult time mediating violence between ethnic communities in Nigeria, and I wrote an email to a professor called John Paul Lederach. Some of you may know him. He's really known for his skills in conflict transformation. So in our world, he's really big in the world of violence and conflict transformation. So I was following up on ideas. He wrote a really beautiful book called The Moral Imagination, where he explores the question of how local communities in war zones find ways to break circles of violence while still living in the conditions that create them. So I had developed a complicated conflict analysis with the communities in which we had used to design the dialogue process. So in his email response to me, which was one paragraph in one sentence, he said, okay, after saying hello and how are you and thank you, and he said, there are elements that are critical to conflict transformation that are easily overlooked. We tend more towards the capacity for analysis of content issues, understanding of key stakeholders, and design of processes, but we underestimate what we may need in the visionary, emotional, and core characteristics and qualities of leaders that show up in our ability to know a problem, but have not prepared the human ecology of leadership needed to change it. So I translated that. Okay, we had more conversations, but what he was telling me was find leaders, find change agents within the communities. And I have found, and I think it's one of the most important things that I'm going to say today, that the most consistent leaders in changing mindsets of warring ethnic communities and working towards pluralistic solutions have been people in the teaching profession, both men and women. The educators I work with in conflict zones, they give me new ideas of possibilities to engage ethnic and racially mixed educator groups. And teachers in communities in violence are still respected. People seek them out for opinions. Many teachers want to contribute to solutions. They don't know how to end ethnic and racial conflicts, but they don't know how. And we need to embed pluralism in existing values and build new values and attitudes working with teachers. And this award that, this one, this was the award night. It came with some money, and I'm using that money to find women like myself, women who work in communities, women nobody knows about, but they work they're not even trained to do it, but they just say enough is enough, we're not going to live with these differences anymore, and I'm trying to find a solution, and then getting their stories out. And I have found inevitably that so many of those women are teachers, and it's a really beautiful story. I'm putting it together, and I'll get it out, and then hopefully next year I'll be able to provide more and more candidates for not only Oxford, but for all the other spaces you work in, of women like me who can come and speak to you about why pluralism is really a solution and why we should not diminish people's identities. We should work with those identities to find solutions. Thank you very much, and sorry, Jayne, for not finishing this.